And we're back for part four, the paraphrase. Now, part three, the real part three, we talked about summaries. We talked about what verb tense to use in a summary. We talked about why you'd use your own words, or that you should use your own words. And here we're going to talk about a paraphrase. Now, a lot of people get the paraphrase and the summary mixed up, but it's really quite simple. A paraphrase is a more detailed restatement than a summary. It's a paraphrase that focuses concisely on a single main idea within a work. Your own rendition of essential information ideas expressed by someone else, presented in a new form, and that is to say, it's in your own words. The legitimate way, when accompanied by accurate documentation, is to borrow from a source. So why is paraphrasing a valuable skill? It's better often than quoting information from an undistinguished clunky passage or one that goes on too long for the purposes of your paper. It shows that you're in control of what you're dealing with, what sources you're working with, that you have the skills to break something down for the purposes of your own writing. And it helps you control the temptation to quote too much, which I often find in my own writing as well as my students. The mental process required for successful paraphrasing helps you grasp the full meaning of the original and shows your readers you aren't intimidated by the source you're working with. Here's some tips on writing a paraphrase. You should reread the original passage until you understand its full meaning. What this also means is that you should only paraphrase passages that you have a full grasp of. When you decide to paraphrase a passage from a source, set the original aside and write your paraphrase in your notes. Jot down a few words below your paraphrase to remind you later how, that is, where in your paper, you decide using this paraphrase material. Say a paraphrase you think relates to a certain claim that supports your overall argument. So the part of this reading that you're reading from and that you're paraphrasing will actually help out the part of your argument. Besides your notes, write a key word or phrase to indicate the subject of your paraphrase, where it might appear in your essay. And at the top of your notes, write a key word or phrase to indicate the subject of your paraphrase. So I think those overlap a lot, but the key takeaway for this, for these tips, is to, when you do paraphrase something, try to envision, however roughly, where it will appear in your essay. Check that paraphrase with the original and make sure your version accurately expresses it all, and also check again to make sure you're not using in the original passage's words. But if you are drawn again and again, and this is important, but if you're drawn again and again to a few words from that original, if you find that language so distinct that your paraphrase will lose meaning with your own words, if you find, in other words, those words unparaphrasable, then you should by all means use those words in a quotation, and we'll get around to quotation later. So record the source, including the page, in your notes. That's essential. If you do use it in your paper, you can credit it easily if you decide to incorporate it later. Now, this might be a little bit before your time, but back in the day we used to use index cards. And I still use index cards for some of my writing projects that are really long, because oftentimes you literally have to shuffle the deck. You have to move one section to another. Nowadays we call it cutting and pasting. When you're working on a longer paper, it might be helpful to write down the entire passage from the original for your own reference's sake. But then it gets sort of messy, and there's lots of actual professional historians and even fiction writers who've gotten in trouble for this, that they inadvertently used other people's words. I'm a little skeptical about that, but these are large projects these people are working on. So here's some examples to compare. This is actually one example we're going to work through for the next couple of minutes. Here's a direct quote. Students frequently overuse direct quotations in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. So this is one man's opinion, James D. Lester, in his book, Writing Research Papers. Wow, I didn't put the publisher there. I'm going to have to fix that. So a good legitimate paraphrase of this. Students quote from their sources too much and too often in their research papers, James D. Lester writes, and fail to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. Now, in this scenario, you're citing the author in text. There he is, in text, James D. Lester. In successive references, and depending on which discipline you're writing in and which style guide you're working off of, MLA, APA, and there's others, Chicago, you can simply write Lester on the first reference or the full name on first reference and Lester on next references. Here's another one that doesn't use Lester in the in-text citation. Students quote from their sources too much and too often in their research papers, some writing teachers believe, and fail to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. So here's the same paraphrase as before, but this is the phrase before, but we are not citing the name of the author in text. Some writing teachers believe is taking the spot of that. Whether or not you cite the author in text depends on a number of factors. It could be the discipline you're writing in and what role these sentences play in your paper. So if this is a research paper in the humanities, if this passage would appear in the introduction and isn't part of the main argument, for example, this would be acceptable. In this scenario, you're using these sentences to set up a larger argument, say plagiarism. So let's talk about some tips in writing a paraphrase. Here's a plagiarized version. Students often use too many direct quotations when they take notes, resulting in too many of them in the final research paper. In fact, probably only about 10% of the final copy should consist of directly quoted material. So it is important to limit the amount of the source material copied while taking notes. Now, why is that plagiarized? Here's another plagiarized version. Well, actually, it's the same one. Let me scroll down here. Why is this a plagiarized version? Well, it's the original words from the source. This is a word-for-word rewording that often ends up with overwrought paraphrase. It also leads to changing the meaning. For example, there's a difference between using too many direct quotations and frequent overuse of direct quotations. But really, the bottom line is, where is the attribution for this guy Lester? Even if you have this citation in your bibliography, your works cited, you're not really doing your job here. So, hold on just a sec. Let me bring this up. Can I bring you up? No. Yes, I can. So that thus endeth our paraphrase chapter here. The next part will be quotations.